All right. Well, hey, good morning. Like Jeff said, my name's Robbie. I'm the senior minister here at Gateway. And Jeff just mentioned giving and generosity, and I got to brag on you guys for just a second. As many of you know, if you've been around for the last month or so, all throughout the month of April, we were collecting disaster supplies. We were collecting disaster relief boxes through a program called Family to Family through one of our mission partners, World Compassion Network. And what they were is there were these boxes where we would kind of assemble different like emergency type supplies that people would need when a disaster hits. So disasters like the tornado that came through our community back in December, disasters like the tornadoes that have been hitting around the country kind of like crazy lately over the past couple weeks. And so it was kind of a chance for us to give back in a way that that we saw World Compassion Network give in our community when they were here after the tornado hit here. And so we collected boxes, and I want to tell you, we collected a little bit over 60 boxes. We had 61 boxes that you guys all provided. So thank you guys so much. If you gave a box, if you put together a box, or you gave money towards providing the supplies that go into a box, thank you so much for your generosity. It's a really cool way that God is going to work through our church to provide things for people who are going to be in need as down the road when disasters come, in the same way that other people provided for people in our community when it happened here. And so it's a really cool thing to be a part of the way God works in that way. So like I said, if you gave to that, thank you so much for that, and we appreciate your generosity in that. So yeah, thank you so much. I want to start off this morning though by telling you something that just happened really this last week. On Friday night, my family and I, there was all 6 of us together in the same vehicle. That doesn't happen often, but it's always uncomfortable when it does just because of space. Everybody's getting bigger. So we're all in our minivan, and we're driving, and we're actually on our way to the grocery store from a choir concert that my daughter had. And so we're getting off the interstate at exit 11 right out here, and we're going to turn right to go down MLK to go down to the grocery store. And so there, if you're familiar with that exit, I'll kind of describe it for you if you're not. There are 2 right-hand turn lanes that you can get into, and we got into the far right one, and the light was red, and so the traffic began to back up. We were the 3rd car in line, so there were 2 cars ahead of us. We're in the right lane of 2 lanes turning right, so you got kind of the picture of what's going on. So we're sitting at the stoplight, and there's a sign on the stoplight that says you can turn right on red, which is good, and so we're kind of expecting people to do that, but for whatever reason, the person that was at the front of the line in our lane, they were not moving. And so like I said, we were the 3rd car. The 1st car wasn't turning right on red. They had plenty of opportunities to do it, and apparently the car that was directly in front of us, the 2nd car, they got a little impatient, and they wanted to get going. So did we, and so they pulled off to the side, they pulled off to the shoulder, and went past them and turned right and just went. And my wife and I were sitting in the front seat, we're watching this happen, and we're like running commentary to each other. I was going like, what in the world does this guy think he's doing? Like, you can't do that. And then we were vindicated immediately because as soon as he turned right, the car that was in the other turn lane at the very front turned out to be an unmarked police officer. And he immediately flips on his lights, his siren. He squealed his tires to get around the corner quick enough to get to this guy and pulled him over immediately. And our family, we were just busting up laughing because we had that feeling that we all have when we see something like that happen, right? Like that, well, he kind of deserves it. Like he thought he could do whatever he wanted. And you know what? He deserved to be caught in this situation. See, we all can identify not just with that feeling of oh, I'm glad he got what he deserved, but also with, if we're honest, we can identify with the feeling of the driver who took off early. Like we've all been in those situations. Maybe we're in a hurry, maybe it's some kind of an emergency, but things aren't moving as quickly, and so we pull off on the shoulder, and we maybe you got to turn right, and then you just can't quite get there, and you're like, it's right there. I don't need to wait for this light. I don't need to wait for and so you kind of do that. It's something most of us have done before. We're running late, so we get up on the shoulder until we can turn right where we want. Or maybe it's not that. Maybe you've not done that thing specifically, but there's other things that you've done where you broke the law because you just kind of felt like, well, in this situation, it's really not a big deal. Such as, how many of you have ever thrown away mail that was sent to your house, but it was for the people who lived there before you? Yeah? Felons? Yeah, that's a felony, and we've all probably done that, right? Like it's just something like, oh, it's just such a hassle to write, please return to sender, no longer at this address. And so we just throw it away. We don't even think much of it, but it's something that we do. Or maybe it's not that. Maybe it's just speeding. My neighborhood, it is really difficult for me not to speed, which is crazy, right? Like speeding in any areas is not something we should do. We know that, but speeding in a residential area, not the best. But if you know where I live, kind of our road, half of the neighborhood is like farmland. And so you're driving down the road and there's a neighborhood over here, but the other side is like open farmland. And it just feels like you should be able to go faster than what the speed limit actually is. And so I'm constantly like going way too fast on the road, even though I have kids that play in the front yard. And even though I live 2 doors down from a cop, I just feel like I should be able to do this. It's not that big of a deal. See, we all have these situations where we feel like we should be able to be above the law just a little bit, especially in situations where we think we won't get caught. And sometimes even when we do get caught, we kind of, the way we justify it, we sound almost like Scooby-Doo villains. Like, you ever seen Scooby-Doo at the very end? They always say the same basic thing. Oh, I would have gotten away for it too if it wasn't for you meddling kids or you kids and your dog or whatever they want to say. Like, we tend to justify it. Say, well, I could have got away with it if the cop hadn't been sitting right there, or if this, or, you fill in the blank with what it is. We think a lot of times that things would be better if our situation was just a little bit better. And so we'll take shortcuts to get there. And maybe even sometimes we'll dream about what things could be like if a situation was changed. That if I had more money, or if I had a nicer car, or a better job, or a bigger house, or a nicer boss, or if I had her or him, if I had this relationship, or if I had this person's, you fill in the blank with whatever they have that you want, then things would be better. But we also know, like deep down, we all know that that's not true. In fact, we know this so intuitively that we actually will shake our heads at people who get busted when they act that way, like I did with the guy that got pulled over. That's what they get. That's what they deserve, and we know that. We've been going through this series on the book of Judges. We've been calling it Have It Your Way. And the book of Judges, if you're familiar with it, it's a book about a time in the history of God's people, in the history of Israel, when they were supposed to be living in this covenant faithfulness to God, this deep, intimate relationship with God. That God had promised the people of Israel certain things, that if they would be faithful to Him, He would care for them. And one of the main things that the people were supposed to do was very simple, a very clear directive from God. They were supposed to not have a king. That God was supposed to be their king. He had given them His law, His rules, His advice for how life functions best. And they were to remain faithful to that and not to any particular person. And they were not to place some person in authority over themselves as a nation. But, we talked about this over and over throughout this book, they wanted to be like the nations around them. They wanted to be like the cultures around them. And so before they knew it, they were copying the cultures around them. And we begin to see throughout the book of Judges this cycle develop. And we've talked about this for the last couple of weeks, that there's this cycle where the people will rebel against God. And so God will kind of take His hands off and He'll let things play out according to the way they've rebelled. And He'll let the consequences come, which usually means there's some kind of outside oppressor that comes in, another nation that comes in and begins to take advantage of the people of Israel until they can't take it anymore. And then eventually they get to a place where they'll cry out to God for help. And then God raises up a deliverer. He raises up some person that He works through to save them in some way. And then they'll experience a time of peace for a while. And as we've gone through this book, we've been shaking our heads at Israel as we've seen them time and time again fall under this oppression over and over and over. And we shake our heads at them because we're reading it and we're going, you were just explicitly told. Like it was really clear how this would go if you did this, if you rebelled against God. See, the people of Israel knew better than to do what they were doing, but they just kept doing it anyways. And it makes us want to ask, like, what did they think was going to happen? Like, we've seen it play out over and over throughout the book. What did they think was going to happen? Did they think that things were going to go differently the next time? They've been getting, throughout the book of Judges, they've been getting what they deserve. And yet we've seen time and time again that God is also faithful to them, and he saves them every time. And so while, yes, they get a taste of what they deserve, ultimately, God comes in and rescues them and saves them because that's what he continues to do over and over throughout the book and really in our lives as well. And so last week, we're looking at the story of Gideon, and we saw the way God saved the people of Israel through the actions of Gideon. And if you remember the story, Gideon starts out great, but he gradually kind of learns to trust God more and more and more. There's lots of conversations between Gideon and God. That God leads them to this military victory, frees them from oppression. But then things went really bad. And it happened when Gideon, he stopped consulting God. And he goes on this little revenge tour, if you remember this from last week, and eventually leads the people of Israel into idolatry, which was the very thing he had begun his career fighting against. It was the very thing that he had begun to try and tear down. And what was Israel's response to all this? Do you remember? They wanted to make him king. They wanted to make him king. The one thing that they were told explicitly not to do. And they wanted to do it because they thought that he was the one. They thought that Gideon was the one who had changed their situation. They thought that he was the one who had finally removed the thing that had been keeping them from getting what they thought they wanted. They wanted the freedom to do what they wanted, when they wanted, with whom they wanted, which is really what we want in life. And just like Israel, we think that there's something out there, that there's something external from us that is out there in the world that is keeping us from being able to do what we want when we want. But what happens when that something is removed? What happens when we get what we want on our own terms? We're going to see that today. We're going to see what plays out after Gideon, after the people had gotten they'd been saved by God, but really they thought it was through Gideon. We're going to see what happens when they get what they wanted in the way they wanted it, when they were able to say, look, this person saved us. If you got a Bible with you, go ahead and open it up to Judges chapter 9. We're actually going to begin at the very end of chapter 8, but we're going to spend most of our time in Judges chapter 9. So go ahead and turn there if you got it. We'll have words on the screen as well. We're going to start back at the very end of chapter 8, though. Do you remember when the people came to Gideon and they asked him to be king? Do you remember his response? It's in Judges 8:23. This is what he said. He says, "But Gideon told them, I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." And that's exactly what he should have said in that situation. But yet we see that he says no. But then look at what he does next. Look at verse 30. He, that's Gideon, he had 70 sons of his own, for he had many wives. For somebody who played so humble that he would not accept being king, that's a pretty kingly thing to do. Like that's what kings of all the nations around Israel would have done. And they would have collected all of these wives, some of them marriages for political reasons, others for love, others for other reasons, and they would have had all these wives and had a whole bunch of sons. And so this was exactly what a king would do if they weren't following God. Generally, Israel was not a nation who did this. And the people that we see in Israel's history who did act that way, man, it caused a lot of problems for them. Political problems, family problems, you name it, all kinds of issues. But it's what kings did. And so look at this in the next verse, verse 31. His concubine, who lived in Shechem, also bore him a son whom he named Abimelech. Now, it says that he doesn't only have wives, that he also has concubines, at least one concubine that we know of. If you remember from a few weeks ago, we talked about concubines, and a concubine is like this weird wife slash non-wife slash servant slash mistress slash fill in the blank. It's kind of an ambiguous relationship, but it is some kind of like actual formal relationship. She wouldn't have been like had all the full rights of a wife, but it was this odd relationship. And so Gideon, on top of all of his wives, he has a relationship with this concubine and has a kid with her. And look at what that son gets named. His name is Abimelech. Abimelech is a Hebrew name, and I've been laughing about this all week. Do you know what Abimelech means? It means, my father is king. Gideon names his kid, my father is king. The guy who is so humble that he wouldn't be allowed to be king, he names his kid, my son is king. Or maybe it wasn't him. Maybe the mother named him because he doesn't get to go live with Gideon. It says he's there in the town of Shechem with his mother. So maybe she named him my father as king as a way of like protecting him and reminding people of his royal blood. I don't know what it is, but regardless of what is going on there, everyone knows who Abimelech is. They know that he is Gideon's son. They know that Gideon is acting king. And so Abimelech is the son of the king. And the story goes on. Verse 33. No sooner had Gideon died than the Israelites again prostituted themselves to the Baals. They set up Baal-berith as their god and did not remember the Lord their God, who had rescued them from the hands of all their enemies on every side. This is the point of the story where if you've been following along throughout the book of Judges, this is the point of the story where oppressors normally come. That's their rebellion. The next step is for people to come in from the outside and kind of take over and run roughshod over Israel. But look at what happens here instead. As soon as the guy that was considered king is dead, chapter 9, verse 1, Abimelech, son of Jerubbaal, that's Gideon, son of Jerubbaal, went to his mother's brothers in Shechem and said to them and to all his mother's clan, ask all the citizens of Shechem, which is better for you, to have all 70 of Jerubbaal's sons rule over you, or just one man? Remember that I am your flesh and blood. So Abimelech goes to all of his half-brothers. They have the same mom, different dad. And he basically says to him, hey, wouldn't you rather that me, your half-brother, rule over you than these other guys who have no connection to you at all? And they're like, you know what? Yes, we would. That sounds like a good way to protect ourselves. So yes, we would like that. It goes on, verse 3. When the brothers repeated all this to the citizens of Shechem, they were inclined to follow Abimelech, for they said, he is related to us. They gave him 70 shekels of silver from the temple of Baal-berith, and Abimelech used it to hire reckless scoundrels who became his followers. So they give him money from the temple treasury. Why is there a temple? There shouldn't be, but there is, because they've been worshiping other gods. It's amazing that this temple is there immediately, like it's so soon after Gideon's passing. Another thing, a detail that gets overlooked sometimes is the place this is happening. It says this is happening in the town of Shechem. The town of Shechem was a big deal in the history of Israel. This was the place where Abraham, like the father of the nation of Israel, the guy that it all started with, this was the place where Abraham had received the covenant from God. Understand the implications of this. This would be like if a bunch of our nation's leaders gathered together at Gettysburg today and decided to reinstitute slavery. Like that is this is even beyond that. Like that's the type of just wrongness that is going on here. It's a big deal. This is all happening in Shechem. It's absolutely unthinkable. So Abimelech, He takes the money, says that he hires some reckless scoundrels, some bad guys, and look at verses 5 and 6. He went to his father's home in Ophrah, and on one stone murdered his 70 brothers, the sons of Jerubbaal. But Jotham, the youngest son of Jerubbaal, escaped by hiding. Abimelech goes, he kills all of his brothers, except for the youngest one, Jotham, and he only gets away because he hides. And then the people gather to make him king, to officially crown him king. That one brother who gets away, Jotham, he hears about it, and in the next verses, we're not going to read it because it's kind of a long passage, but I'll summarize it here. He hears about what's going on, hears that they're going to crown Abimelech king, Abimelech who has just murdered all their brothers. And so he comes out of hiding, kind of. He calls out to the assembly while they're gathering. He calls out from a nearby mountain. He yells to them. And as he does, he tells them a story. He tells them a parable. And it goes something like this. He says, look, all the trees of the forest, they were looking for a king. And so they go to the olive tree and they ask the olive tree to be their king. And the olive tree says basically, you know what? My olive oil business kind of blowing up right now. I'm good. I don't want to step into that role because things are going well for me right now. And so then they go to the fig tree. And the same thing, the fig tree's like, who knew? Somebody put figs with cookies, fig Newtons. It's really popular. I'm kind of rolling in money right now. I don't want to deal with this. So then they go to the grapevine. No, I'm good. The wine business is good right now. So eventually the trees, they go to a thorn bush. A thorn bush who trees know have no business being king over trees. And they ask him anyway, and this thorn bush accepts their offer, becomes king, and then fire comes out from the thorn bush and burns down all the trees. And that's the story that Jotham tells. And he basically says to them, hey, this is what's going to happen. Abimelech, he's that thorn bush. He's the one that you know shouldn't be king, but he is, and it's going to go badly for you. Understand that parable, it has an implicit criticism in there of Gideon's other sons, all those sons who are dead now. The implication being that some of them were qualified to lead, but their own self-interest led them to choose not to. So Israel found somebody who would. They found somebody who would fill the role that they wanted, even though they knew exactly who Abimelech was. He's just murdered his brothers. And they make him king anyway. Come on, what were they supposed to do? He was the only person willing to take the job. And if the only person willing to take the job is a bad choice, well, then I guess you're stuck with the bad choice, right? They wanted a king. They had found their guy. They went into this eyes wide open about who Abimelech was. Jotham warns them, says, hey, it's not going to end well. And then he runs off into hiding. You don't hear from him again. Fast forward a couple years. Judges 9, verse 22. After Abimelech had governed Israel for 3 years, God stirred up animosity between Abimelech and the citizens of Shechem so that they acted treacherously against Abimelech. The very people who had appointed Abimelech king, they try to change course. But as you can see, as you're about to see, they do it a little too late. See, they'd put this unscrupulous megalomaniac on the throne to rule over them, and then after 3 years of it, they're like, you know what, I don't know that this is a good idea. And so the next several verses, it outlines how they're ready for something else. They're ready for a new leader, and so they choose a new leader who decides he's going to overthrow Abimelech. And to make a long story short, Abimelech and his ruthless scoundrels, his army of guys, they wipe the floor with this other guy. Like they just wipe him out quickly and easily. And then, now that Abimelech knows that the people have turned on him, and they supported somebody who was there to overthrow him, he retaliates. Look at chapter 9, verse 42. The next day, the people of Shechem went out to the fields, and this was reported to Abimelech. So he took his men, divided them into 3 companies, and set an ambush in the fields. When he saw the people coming out of the city, he rose to attack them. They thought they could just go back to business as usual. And let's just go back out, let's start harvesting like we normally would, let's care for our crops. But Abimelech is like, nah, no, you don't get to turn on me and then just not have consequences. So he attacks the civilian workers who come out to tend the crops. And then he presses on. If you continue reading in the story, he presses on, and eventually he overruns the entire city of Shechem. The last people that are still alive in the city, they flee to the temple, the very temple that had funded Abimelech and his rise to power. That temple kind of doubled as a stronghold, kind of like a last stand for the people of Shechem. They gathered there. Look what happens in verse 49. So all the men cut branches and followed Abimelech. They piled them against the stronghold and set it on fire with the people still inside. So all the people in the tower of Shechem, about 1,000 men and women, also died. This unspeakable violence on the very people who had once supported him. And you would think, like, that's a dumpster fire of a story already, but it keeps going. I can't believe this next word is even there. Next, verse 50. Next, Abimelech went to Thebez and besieged it and captured it. Like, this is bad enough. There shouldn't be a next, but he goes on to the next city and he does the same thing just to make sure everyone knows not to mess with him in the future. But when he does it, there's kind of a surprise ending. Look at verse 52. Abimelech went to the tower, attacked it, but as he approached the entrance to the tower to set it on fire, a woman dropped an upper millstone on his head and cracked his skull. An upper millstone was essentially like a kitchen appliance of the day. This would be like if like somebody had thrown their KitchenAid mixer or like a tabletop blender or something like that out the window, and it falls, cracks this guy in the head, cracks his skull. It's this incredibly painful thing, but it should bring back some echoes of a story we've already seen in Judges. It should bring back the story of Deborah. Do you remember that one? Where a military leader is killed by a non-combatant female housewife, Jael. She kills Sisera, the leader of the Syrian army, with a tent peg. You remember that one? But in that situation, that was a non-Israelite saving Israel from an outside oppressor. This is worse. This is a non-combatant female Israelite saving Israel from Israel. Israel had been so bent on gaining power, specifically the military kind of power, that this is now the second time God has delivered them from that type of power through the very subversion of that power that they've been so hungry for. Look at verse 55. When the Israelites saw that Abimelech was dead, they went home. Even the people who had been following him to the end, they knew once he was gone, there was nothing worth fighting for anymore. There's no general that rises up to try and continue the cause. They're all just like, yeah, this was bad. And they go home. And that's like the end of it. That's the end of the story. They go home. It's another trash bag of a story. Judges is full of these stories that are just messy, and you see all kinds of violence and terrible things happen, and you really there's not a great explanation for why. Abimelech was a horrible leader. Notice that all throughout this story, God was not with him. There's no mention of God anywhere in this story. And it's tempting for you and I to sit and to listen to this story or to read this story on our own and to think that this is a story about leadership, that this is a story about the type of leaders we should be looking for or not looking for. Basically, the idea is don't be like Abimelech, don't abuse your position of power. Well, that's pretty good because I don't plan on being crowned king anytime soon, and you probably don't either. And so it's like one of those stories that we just kind of throw away. It's like, yeah, that was a good story for them, but it doesn't really apply to me. But the problem is that if we focus on what we learn from Abimelech, it's just a really shallow reading. But it's the one we tend to gravitate toward because it's more comfortable. See, when we can dismiss what happened in Israel as being the isolated acts of a dictator with a lust for vengeance, then we miss the power of the story. See, the people in this story that we need to be paying attention to, it's not Abimelech, but we need to be paying attention to who are the people that created an environment where someone like Abimelech could be so celebrated. Remember, the point of connection throughout Judges is not the judges that we're hearing about, or in this case, the king. We pay attention not to what they do, we pay attention to what God does and to what the people of God, to what Israel does. And so do you remember how this all started? Judges 8:33, the very beginning of the story. No sooner had Gideon died than the Israelites again prostituted themselves to the Baals. They set up Baal-berith as their god, and did not remember the Lord their God, who had rescued them from the hands of their enemies on every side. God had been so faithful to them, but yet their perspective was that the problem was their circumstances. Their problem, all throughout the book, has been these foreign oppressors who would come in, but Israel's problem was not them. Israel's problem was Israel. And you see this so clearly in this story. Think about it. There's no miraculous outpouring of God's judgment in this story, and there's no miraculous saving either. There's no miracle flood like in the story of Deborah, and there's no miracle of an army of 300 defeating an army of 120,000 like there was in the story of Gideon. God simply lets the natural consequences of Israel's choices play out. Gideon's self-centeredness produced a son with the same tendency and the same desire to be king. The town of Shechem's disregard for God's commands and the pursuit of their own self-interest leads them to select Abimelech to be their king. Abimelech's treachery and backstabbing is what leads to his downfall. And what this all shows us as we look at everyone involved in this story, it tells us this, is that sin is its own curse. See, it's not that God curses you because of your sin. We all bring hardship on ourselves. We bring hardship into our lives because of sin. Every single sin has a built-in consequence. It doesn't lead to good places. We like to think of sin as like God's rules, and that if we violate God's rules, then he gets angry with us. But the reality is that God has those rules there for our protection, and when we violate them, it brings bad things upon ourselves, and sometimes God just lets that play out. He lets us have things our way. See, sometimes the decisions we make, they may get us what we want in the short term, but who says that what you want in the short term is what God says is best? Sin will always lead you away from God's best for you. Can you recognize that? There are only two types of people in the world. There are people who say to God, have it your way, and there are those who God says back to them, no, have it your way. See, so often we want to blame our circumstances or the people outside of us who sin against us. And while that is a real problem, I don't want to downplay that that's a problem. It happens. But the problem is not primarily out there. The problem is in here. See, we tend to think that our problems will go away if something outside of us changes. If we had more money, a better job, if we lived there, if we had a different boss or different coworkers or better behaved kids, or you fill in the blank with whatever. That if we had this thing, or if this other thing was removed, then things would be better. And yes, some of those things may help. They may be good things, but none of them will fix the real problem. The problem is not primarily out there, it's in here. It's true on two levels. It's true on an individual level. We saw Abimelech's vengeance. It was stirred up because he thought the problem was out there. The problem was them, and I need to get them. He didn't think the problem was him. But it's also true on a corporate level, that the people of God, collectively, they've been in this mindset of thinking that their problem was the Midianites, or the Canaanites, or the Amorites, or whoever was coming in to invade and to overthrow them. They thought their problems were all out there. And yet the Israelites, they let this environment develop that gives rise to a king like Abimelech because they had abandoned God. the church, the people of God, we are complicit in the evil that we allow to rise up within us. It's not a he or a she problem. It's a we, it's a me problem. We dare not become people who are characterized by our condemnation of others while we refuse to examine ourselves. We need to examine our community, our body of believers here as a local church, the wider spread body of believers around the city and around the country and around the world. And we need to examine our own hearts, because here's the truth. We don't need a better situation. We need a better king. See, so often we come to God because we want him to fix something. We need more money, a better marriage, whatever it might be. We need those things, and we may genuinely need those things, but what we really need is freedom from our own heart. See, we long for a king that will fix our situation, but my pursuit of that effectively places me on the throne. That's a huge problem that we see throughout Scripture. It's a huge problem I see in my life. You probably see it in yours. And we see it throughout the book of Judges, that everyone did as they saw fit. We don't need a better situation. We need a better king. That's what we learn when we look at the people of God in this story. But what do we learn when we look at God in this story? See, he does show up at the very end of the story. Judges 9:56 says, "Thus God repaid the wickedness that Abimelech had done to his father by murdering his 70 brothers. God also made the people of Shechem pay for all their wickedness. The curse of Jotham, son of Jerubbaal, came on them." See, God doesn't just let evil run rampant when his people allow sin and evil to rule. That eventually, God will repay all evil. Eventually, it will happen. And that should be comforting to us. It should be a comfort to know that all the wrong that we see in the world, all the evil that just gets us worked up when we look around and we see all the pain and the injustice and the heartache, it should affect us in that way. And we can have peace to know that God will deal with that. But it should also give us pause that he does repay evil. He did it in this story, and he's done it throughout history. Evil is eventually dismantled and punished and defeated. And oftentimes it happens the way we see it in Judges. Sometimes it happens through like military regimes changing things in our world. And sometimes it happens through, kind of smaller situations on the ground, whatever it might be. That oftentimes God works through someone or a group of someone's to bring justice. But even in the times when we don't see it happen in our world, when we don't see it happen in our lifetime, we can trust that God will repay all evil. We don't need a better situation, we need a better king. And God sent that king, Jesus. Jesus repaid evil and will also finally repay evil when he returns at the second coming. See, he repaid evil, but he also paid for evil on the cross. Colossians chapter 1, beginning in verse 13, it says this, "For he," speaking of Jesus, "for he has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son he loves, in whom we have redemption." The forgiveness of sins. That word redemption, it gives the idea of freedom that is given to somebody through the payment of a ransom. Is that Jesus came and lived a perfect life, and then he gave himself as a ransom for our sin on the cross. Jesus paid for the debt that you could not hope to repay. Unlike Abimelech, Jesus had every single right to demand service from us as our king. But unlike Abimelech, Jesus maintained all throughout his life that he did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. He poured out his blood to clothe us with his righteousness and to give us a seat at his table forever. And unlike the trees who were too self-interested to rule, Jesus was more than willing to be our shepherd. When we chopped him down and we killed him, he didn't burn us to the ground in his anger. He willingly took the fire of God's judgment so that we could be saved. The millstone of God's judgment was dropped on his head. He is the true king that we seek, and he is that king in every way. We tend to think that salvation comes when our circumstances change. God says salvation comes through grace that was provided through our King Jesus, who paid for our sin so that we could live free forever with God. So the question is that enough? Earlier we sang a song, and we sang the last song before we moved into our time of communion. We sang the words, "If all I have is Jesus, I have everything." This is true. We're going to finish with the song. We're going to sing a song called House of God Forever. And the very first line of the song, I want you to pay close attention to it. The very first line of the song is, "God is my shepherd, I won't be wanting." The implication being that God is enough. That God is our leader, God is our shepherd, God is our king, is everything we could need. And so as we sing this song today, as we wrap up, I want you to sing this song and declare, as you sing this, it is your declaration that God is enough for you, that Jesus' sacrifice on the cross was enough to pay for your debt and to repay all of the debts that are owed to you by other people, and most importantly, to repay the debts that are owed to God. Jesus is our shepherd king. Let's sing to him this morning. Let's pray. Father, we love you. We thank you so much for Jesus. God, thank you for being the king, not the king that we wanted, but the king that we needed. That God, we tend to gravitate towards people and things that produce the kind of temporary good that we want to see in our lives, and it's a good that we define. God, would you help to change our hearts to recognize that your way is best, that sin always leads us away from you. That God, freedom is not found in our circumstances changing. That God, our freedom is found in you and your work for us on the cross. Father, we love you. It's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen.